Last time we spoke about the Second Jilin War. After the First Jilin War of 1922, the Jilin Warlords took control over Beijing. Cao Kun bribed his way into the presidency as Jang Suuchi retreated to Manchuria to rebuild his army. Jang Suuchi appointed key officials and he boosted military production, significantly enhancing his army, navy, and air force. The catalyst for the Second Jilin War in 1924 was the First Jang Suuchi Jang War. Jang Suuchi declared war on the Jilin clique, accusing them of corruption and oppression. The war saw battles at Ruhe, Shanhaiguan, and other locations, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. However, the Jilin forces were plagued by internal betrayal and logistical challenges. Fang Yuyuan's unexpected coup in Beijing further weakened the Jilin's position. Ultimately, the Fangtian army's superior strategy and coordination led to their victory, capturing key cities and forcing the Jilin leaders to flee. This episode is the First United Front. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Over there I'm releasing a series on the Japanese invasion of North China and Inner Mongolia. Also, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where for as little as $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive Patreon podcast, early access to all of my content, and voting rights for what I will tackle next. Give it a look. The Second Jilin War was by far the most intense war to date for China's warlord era. Perhaps up to 450,000 troops participated in battles stretching along the Great Wall line from Shanhaiguan to Beijing. The casualties were reported to be around 30,000, but estimates for China's warlord era are notoriously flimsy. Ultimately, it was won by Fang Yuyuan's betrayal against Wu Peifu. Fang Yuyuan's Beijing coup certainly turned the tide, and now he had emerged as a major player at the scene. Fang Yuyuan went to work expelling the former emperor of the Qing dynasty, Puyi, from the Forbidden City, and he placed Cao Kun under house arrest. Now, immediately after Fang Yuyuan had taken Beijing, he began reorganizing his forces into the First National Army, or better known as the Guomingjun. Fang Yuyuan acted as its commander-in-chief with his co-conspirators, He Qingyi and Sun Yue, as commanders of the Second and Third Armies. Now, the Guomingjun were certainly an odd, kind of motley crew. The Guomingjun's ideology was a blend of Chinese nationalism, progressive social reform, military modernization, and ethical governance influenced by Christianity. Fang Yuyuan's leadership and his vision shaped the faction into quite a unique force, striving to create a unified, modern, and moral China. Within his territories, Fang Yuyuan promoted education, he built schools, he established social welfare programs. He believed that improving the living standards of the common people was essential for national strength and stability. He implemented a series of social reforms in the areas he controlled. These included land reforms aimed at reducing the power of landlords and distributing land more equitably among peasants. His Guomingjun would become known for their efforts to combat corruption and inefficiency within their ranks and in the administration of the territories they controlled. Fang Yuyuan sought to create a more ethical and efficient government. He supported the modernization of China's infrastructure and industry. This would include building railways, improving communications, promoting technological advancements, and such. The Guomingjun were driven by a strong sense of Chinese nationalism, emphasizing the need to unify China and to end the fragmentation caused by warlordism. They aimed to establish a central government that could restore national sovereignty and territorial integrity. The Guomingjun placed a high emphasis on military discipline and modern training methods. Fang Yuyuan's background in the Beiyang army influenced his approach to building a modern professional military force. The Guomingjun's ideological alignment with nationalism and reform brought them into close cooperation with the Kuomintang. The alliance with the KMT was based on shared goals of unification and modernization, though it was sometimes strained by ideological and strategic differences. Yet, more importantly, because of the geographical distance between their spheres of influence, they would be more or less isolated from each other, and thus it would be very difficult to coordinate any type of action. Fang Yuyuan had hoped by imprisoning Cao Kun and exiling Pu Yi, he would gain popular support amongst the Republican and anti-Manchu-minded people in the Beiyang government. Fang Yuyuan also proclaimed the Guomingjun troops to be the first in the history of the Republic to serve as a national military establishment rather than his own personal army. However, no one forgot his acts of treachery. The coup d'etat certainly gave him a bad reputation. One of the few successes he would have was persuading Dr. Sun Yat-sen to come over to Beijing to take part in the new government. With the collapse of the Zhuli clique, a more tenuous balance of power had emerged in Beijing. Fang Yuyuan's position in Beijing was weakened each day because of the maneuvers of Jang Suuchi. He had moved the Fangxian forces south of Manchuria, proceeding south of the Tianjin-Pukou Railway. This effectively gave Jang Suuchi control over East China, from Manchuria all the way to the Yangtze Valley. Alongside this, Jang Suuchi reached an agreement with Duan Qire to bring him into a new fold. A 5-day conference took place in Tianjin from November the 11th to the 16th, including the new triumvirate of Jang Suuchi, Fang Yuyuan, and Duan Qire. They discussed the future of the Beiyang government. Fang Yuyuan quickly discovered he had little negotiating power beyond his dominance in the Beijing area, and even that was tenuous as Jang Suuchi pretty much surrounded them all. Fang Yuyuan found out that his trump card, the promise from Dr. Sun Yat-sen that he would come participate in the new Beiyang government, was useless, as both Jang Suuchi and Duan Qire had likewise received the same kind of promise from Dr. Sun Yat-sen. During the conference, the new triumvirate agreed Duan Qire would become a figurehead over the new government, with a position called the chief executive. Despite Duan Qire's status as a leader of the practically non-existent Anhui clique, he was more palatable to the surviving Zhuli clique warlords than either Fang Yuyuan or Jang Suuchi. They made sure not to make Duan Qire a president or a premier. His role was specifically meant to be temporary. This was done to lure Dr. Sun Yat-sen over to Beijing. Meanwhile, Fang Yuyuan and Jang Suuchi retained their territories and became the military leaders of the new regime. On November the 24th, Duan Qire arrived to Beijing to assume his new office. On December the 9th, the foreign powers recognized Duan Qire's new government on the basis he did not alter their pre-existing unequal treaties. This, of course, was inevitable, as Japan was the leading imperial power in Asia, and they backed both Jang Suuchi and Duan Qire. He formed a cabinet without any Guomingjun members. It would seem no one had forgotten Fang Yuyuan's treachery, but then again, his Guomingjun had no officers with sufficient prestige to be nominated to any posts. Fang Yuyuan had little hope of exerting any control in this new government. Fang Yuyuan responded to the rather dire situation by resigning his post as Inspector General, and he retired, stating he would spend his future in study and travel. Yet his Guomingjun forces still controlled Beijing. Jang Suuchi took a cue from his move by also resigning from his titles, heading over to Tianjin. Thus, Duan Qire, with no military power, personally under threat of Fang Yuyuan's forces who surrounded Beijing, was facing a daunting situation. He had to try and maintain the peace between the two warlords while forming a government acceptable to the foreign powers. His government then decided to make Fang Yuyuan and Jang Suuchi defense commissioners of the Northwest and the Northeast respectively. Fang Yuyuan now would control Saiyuan and Chahar provinces, setting up his new headquarters in Kalgan. Fang Yuyuan's new position did not prove lucrative, and it was not adequate for a power base. His only real ally was the KMT, but they were way too far away, and thus he was quite isolated. So where would he turn to? The Soviet Union. Fang Yuyuan's socialist actions had attracted the attention of the communists, and indeed within his entourage, many were communists, secretly at least. The Soviets were enemies with the Empire of Japan. The Empire of Japan backed Jang Suuchi, so the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The Soviets basically saw Fang Yuyuan as a possible balance against the Japanese, who were continuing to expand their influence in Manchuria. Dr. Sun Yat-sen came north, alongside a Soviet member named Michael Borodin. Dr. Sun Yat-sen had pleaded with Western nations for a very long time to support his government with finance and arms, but no one offered anything tangible. Sun Yat-sen's problem was his hard stance against the unequal treaties. All of the Western powers knew it was Dr. Sun Yat-sen's priority to get rid of the unequal treaties. Thus, they all refused to support his efforts. However, there was a new nation that did not support the unequal treaties. In fact, they even publicly stated so, that being the Soviet Union. Back in autumn of 1920, Sun Yat-sen met with representatives of the Kuomintang in Shanghai. Apparently, in a private conversation, Sun Yat-sen told them that he believed Lenin wanted him to be the founder of the CCP, because Chen Duxiu did not have much influence with the people of China, unlike him. He was kind of a rock star after all. After numerous attempts to gain support from Japan or the West, Sun Yat-sen began to seriously consider cooperating with the CCP, who were being supported by the Soviet Union. In December of 1921, Sun Yat-sen met with Hendrix Josephs Franciscus Marie Snevliet, who went under the common name Marin. Because that name is very long, we will just call him Marin from now on. He met him in Guilin. Marin was an official representative of the Kuomintang. Sun Yat-sen came to him expressing his admiration for the Russian Revolution and for Lenin. He stated that he wanted to learn more about the Soviets' achievements, especially their new economic policies. In August of 1922, the Soviet diplomat to China, Adolf Joffe, was trying to settle issues regarding Outer Mongolia and the Chinese Far Eastern Railway, to which he had little to no success. But during the process, he met with Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen brought up the idea of cooperating with the CCP. It sounded promising. For a few months, the Soviets brainstormed, and by the Fourth Congress of the Communist International, they decided to get the CCP to agree to a kind of alliance. In July of 1922, the CCP accepted Marin's proposal to join the Kuomintang in some kind of alliance. This would become known as the Sun-Joffe Manifesto, and it would result in what became known as the First United Front. In July, the Soviets instructed the CCP to join the alliance, but there was a ton of pushback. Over in Hanzhou, Marin met with Chen Duxiu, Li Dajiao, Cai He-sun, Zhang Guotao, Gao Jianyu, and Zhang Daili. Marin pointed out to them that the Kuomintang was a party of classes who were trying to promote democratic revolution. The CCP joining the KMT would be in line with Lenin's outline on the International Communist Revolution. However, many of the CCP's leadership pointed out issues, like all the anti-communist elements in the KMT. But ultimately, they decided it was a good idea, as the reality was the CCP at this point was only like 300 members. They needed help to grow. Thus, it was decided some of the CCP leading figures would join the KMT, with the secret intent of persuading KMT members to join the CCP. According to testimony from Zhou Fuhai, a CCP member at the time, who would later go on to join Wang Jingwei's collaborationist government. At the time, the Soviets wanted to collude with Wu Peifu, so it first gave Wu Peifu the honorific title of Enlightened Warlord. At the time, Sun Hongyi was close to Wu Peifu, while Li Dajiao was close to Sun Hongyi. They took advantage of this relationship, and they had a secret relationship with Wu Peifu. Li Dajiao went to Liaoyang several times, and it seems there were records in the newspapers at the time of this. His methods were really clever. Wu Peifu ordered Gao Anheng to appoint communists as the chief inspectors of the four lines of the Beijing Hankow, Beijing Fengtian, Jinpu, and Langhai. The inspector of the Beijing Hankow was Bao Hucai. The inspector of Jinpu seemed to be Li Mingju. Before the Soviets were abandoned by Wu Peifu, it once had an affair with Chen Zhongming. Chen Zhongming specially summoned Chen Duxiu to Guangdong as its education committee member, chairman of the National People's Congress. At that time, Chen Zhongming's rebellious deeds were already well known, and Guangdong was clearly divided into two factions, Sun and Chen. The Soviets naturally used its strength to shift the situation, so the Soviets colluded with them. Chen Zhongming paid 500 yuan a month to Chen Gongbo to publish the Kunbao, which was a result of their collusion. Later, when Chen Zhongming was hiding in Huizhou, Ma Lin and Tan Pingshan went to Huizhou twice to discuss the terms of cooperation. Who would have thought that Chen Zhongming would dare to bombard Guanyin Mountain, or endanger Premier Sun. After this rebellious act, Chen Jiangming was despised by the Chinese people. The Soviets were afraid of the attack of public opinion, so it did not dare to openly ally with such a man. Abandoned by Wu Beifu in the north and isolated from Chen Jiangming in the south, the Soviets in 1923 followed the orders of the Third International, and they tried to infiltrate the Kuomintang and carried out its conspiracy to destroy the Kuomintang. On January the 12th of 1923, the Soviets passed a resolution recognizing the First United Front. Sun Yat-sen accepted the alliance, but with two reservations. Number one, China would never become a communist nation. Number two, the Soviets would give up the unequal treaties the Russian Empire had previously held over China. On January the 26th, Sun Yat-sen and Joffre issued a joint statement declaring the cooperation between the KMT, CCP, and the Soviet Union. Now, it's important to note, Sun Yat-sen did not believe the Soviet system could or would even be functional for China. He believed China's largest problem was reunification under national independence. The Soviets abolished the unequal treaties that the Russian Empire had made with China, and they declared Outer Mongolia was part of China, resolving the entire debacle that was going on. The Soviets even stated they promised not to carry out a communist revolution within China. Sun Yat-sen stated publicly he was willing to accept CCP members into the KMT. Now, this was clearly all done in order to receive Soviet finances and arms. But secondly, he truly believed their membership would help strengthen the nationalist movement. Many in the KMT were very, very concerned with this venture. On February the 9th of 1924, at Tsinghua University, Sun Yat-sen was answering questions about the issue, where he stated, "Russia is Russia, and China is China. Russia has its own ideology, and China has its own ideology. In my previous speech, I mentioned Russia everywhere. I was talking about the organization of its revolutionary party, not its revolutionary ideology." Now here comes Mr. Borodin. In September of 1923, Borodin was sent to serve as Sun Yat-sen's political advisor, specifically responsible for facilitating the First United Front. Borodin spoke no Chinese, thus he conversed in English. And kind of funny enough, he had a very heavy Midwestern American accent, which masked his Russian origin, helping him communicate with the largely Anglophile and American-educated leadership within the KMT. He was accompanied by one Ho Chi Minh, yes, the future leader of Communist Vietnam. Borodin showed up in early October to Guangzhou, where he held some private talks with the CCP. The CCP had been complaining about the KMT, how they were quite anti-communist in general, and how the alliance did not seem to make any sense since they had just promised to not usher in a communist revolution. Borodin then told them the real purpose of the alliance was actually to reorganize efforts to infiltrate the KMT, end quote. In the newspapers, I talked about the Kuomintang, but for us, what I said was actually the increase in influence of the CCP. We must never forget that what we are actually doing is to stabilize the CCP. This goal should be remembered forever. Now, despite the new alliance with the Soviets, Sun Yat-sen did not stop reaching out to the Americans or the Japanese, and this caused Borodin some headaches. In Borodin's report to Joseph Stalin in January of 1924, he had this to say. I asked Sun Yat-sen again and again, how long will he hold on to the fantasy that the Chinese people may get some help from the United States, Britain, or Japan? Hasn't he been waiting for such help for too long? Isn't it time to sum up the past, full of illusions and failures, and turn to the new path? In late January of 1924, during the First Congress of the Kuomintang, Sun Yat-sen expanded upon the three principles of the peoples, and this deeply concerned Borodin, who reported back to Stalin, Sun Yat-sen agreed to the revolutionary program formulating for the Kuomintang, which catered to us, but he disagreed to publicly say that he would establish a united front with us. For this reason, he does not fully trust us. Borodin also came to Sun Yat-sen about the program, stating, You are facing a choice. Do you want to move forward with the 1.5 billion people in the imperialist camp? Or do you want to move forward with the 1.25 billion people who are oppressed by imperialism? You should make a decision. Although Sun Yat-sen would accept many of Borodin's suggestions, ultimately it was Sun Yat-sen calling the shots, and he would butt heads often with Borodin. Borodin stated at one point to those around him, "The American spirit was deeply rooted in his mind. Generally speaking, it was difficult to make Sun Yat-sen change his mind." By the end of 1923, Chiang Kai-shek led Dr. Sun Yat-sen's delegation to the Soviet Union. Chiang Kai-shek reported back to Sun Yat-sen, "The strategy of purpose of the Soviet Union's so-called world revolution is more dangerous to the independence movement of Eastern nations than Western colonialism." Sun Yat-sen replied that he believed Chiang Kai-shek was overly worrying, and that, quote, "He deeply believed that only by allowing Chinese Communist Party members to be under the leadership of our party and under the unified command of our party can we prevent them from creating class struggles and hindering the progress of our national revolution. If our northern expedition is victorious, the three principles of the people can be implemented as scheduled. By then, even if the Soviets want to sabotage our national revolution, it will be impossible. Moreover, the Soviet Union only recognizes our party as the only party leading the revolution in China, and strongly urges its CCP members to join our party and obey our leadership, but does not deny that China has no possibility of implementing its communism. Therefore, it still insists on its decision to ally with Russia and tolerate the CCP." Trouble soon brewed in June of 1924. Many leading KMT figures wrote to Sun Yat-sen accusing the CCP of raising the banner of anti-imperialism and anti-militarism, causing the KMT to suffer scorn from Western powers and the Chinese nationalists. Sun Yat-sen knew of the problem. It was largely CCP students led by Chen Duxiu making a scene. He explained, "The Chinese young students headed by Chen Duxiu are self-righteous. They initially wanted to monopolize Russian relations and prevent Russia from interacting with our party. Peter used Russia to help establish his own faction and compete with our party. If I suspect Chen Duxiu and implicate Russia, it will be exactly what Chen Duxiu is planning and help him succeed. If Chen Duxiu and others do not obey our party, I will abandon them." Sun Yat-sen also tried his best to restrict the CCP to be in his own direct orbit. Chen Duxiu had been repeatedly criticizing Sun Yat-sen's policies in newspapers, so Sun Yat-sen went to Borodin to correct the issue. "Since the CCP has joined the KMT, they should obey party discipline and should not publicly criticize the KMT. If the CCP do not obey the KMT, I will expel them. If the Soviet Union protects the Chinese Communist Party, I will oppose the Soviet Union." Sun Yat-sen honestly failed to see the threat that the CCP really posed. He truly believed the CCP joined the KMT in an unequal alliance. He believed the KMT was China's only revolutionary party, while the CCP was just a group of scholars who supported Leninism. He never really took them seriously, but he also made sure never to give them arms when they continuously demanded them. As for the CCP, they regarded the KMT as quite backwards. Many leaders in the CCP thought Dr. Sun Yat-sen was no different than any of the other warlords. When Marin proposed to the CCP that they join the KMT, Chen Duxiu raised opposition, arguing, "The purpose and foundation of the revolution of the CCP and the KMT are different. The KMT's policy of alliance with the United States, Jiang Suuchi and Duan Qilei are too incompatible with communism. Outside Guangdong province, it is still regarded as a political party fighting for power and profit. The Sun Yat-sen faction of the KMT has always been absolutely intolerant of the opinions of new members and cannot give them power." A lot of the CCP resented what they saw as Sun Yat-sen's appeasing of the right wing while disenfranchising the left wing. Once the First United Front was established, the Soviets took over management of the Chinese Eastern Railway and began occupying Outer Mongolia. Then money and arms began pouring in, alongside military advisors who came to help create Sun Yat-sen's northern expedition. Sun Yat-sen dispatched Chiang Kai-shek to Moscow to investigate their politics and military, while Borodin was made the KMT's organizational trainer. In May of 1924, Borodin helped found the Whampoa Military Academy. There, officers of the National Revolutionary Army were trained, the very backbone of the KMT. They would all be under the leadership of Dr. Sun Yat-sen's number 2, Chiang Kai-shek. The quality of their education was guaranteed by regular visits from Soviet officers. Many future big names would graduate from the academy, such as Lin Biao and Zhou Enlai. Borodin also established the Peasant Training Institute, where a young Mao Zedong would serve. Things were not all rainbows and sunshine, of course. On May 1st of 1924, a large celebration was held in Guangzhou for the peasant department. Sun Yat-sen went to it, and he gave a speech calling on everyone to fight for national liberation and to put the theme of class struggle in a secondary position. This certainly did not sit well with the CCP, whose members began calling for breaking the alliance and arguing that KMT would lose the support of the Soviet Union. Borodin happened to be away at the time, and when prompted, Sun Yat-sen kept saying that they would resolve the matter when he returned. Very frantic telegrams were sent, and by June the 20th, Borodin returned. On June the 25th, a meeting was held with leaders of the KMT and CCP. Borodin agreed with the point that the CCP was a party within a party of the KMT, but he also stated the KMT had to give some ground to the CCP if they wanted to keep favor with the Soviet Union. Then suddenly a wave of anti-communist statements were lobbed from prominent KMT members such as Wang Jingwei. They further launched a petition to expel certain communists. On July the 15th, in retaliation, Chinese workers in Samian went on strike. Despite these setbacks, the First United Front remained firm. Mao Zedong would see an appointment as Minister of Propaganda of the KMT. His job entailed hunting down newspapers and anyone who distributed leaflets, demanding they come to the propaganda department for review prior. In the next episode, if not in a future one, Mao Zedong's propaganda department would have a lot of work ahead of them. Now, all the way back to when I mentioned Sun Yat-sen and Borodin visited Fang Yuyuan, Borodin came bearing a similar deal to what the KMT-CCP alliance had with the Soviet Union, and at first Fang Yuyuan was uncooperative. Yet, as he was cooped up in his Kalgan HQ, Fang Yuyuan had no backers. He was very low in funds. Most importantly, he lacked arsenal facilities. Fang Yuyuan had struggled to cope. He was hunting down everyone for backers, but the Northwest was not easily accessible. When he made orders with private traders bound for coastal ports, they were simply seized by other local warlords who controlled coastal areas. Without domestic capabilities or access to the sea, Fang Yuyuan was pretty much screwed. Thus, he caved in to the Soviets. An agreement was brought for Soviet financial aid and munitions by February of 1925, brokered by Borodin. From April to August, war materials began to pour into Fang Yuyuan's camp. The cargo was divided into 2 shipments, traveling over the Trans-Siberian Railway from Moscow to Verkhneyarsk, then south over a caravan trade route to Maimaicheng. In 1925, it took 500 Mongol carts to move the small arms, ammunition, rifles, and field guns from Maimaicheng to Ulaanbaatar, then over some motor vehicles to Pingdunchuan, a station on the Beijing-Suyuan Railway, and then it went all the way over to Fangjiang. It was a heavy haul, to be sure. 5,000 cases of petroleum, 1,000 boxes of ammunition, 15,000 rifles, 15 million rounds of rifle ammunition, 27 Colt machine guns, 630,000 machine gun ammunition, 1,000 entrenching tools, 30,000 hand grenades, and 100 poods of explosives. Another haul in 1925 included 64,000 rifles, 15,000 carbines, 32 million rounds of rifle and carbine ammunition, 189 machine guns, 6.4 million rounds of machine gun ammunition, 66 field guns, 18,000 revolvers, 5 million rounds of revolver ammunition, 50 field kitchens, 150 two-wheel carts, and 16,000 swords. With the new supply line, Fang Yuyuan would distance himself gradually from Jiang Zuolin. The new triumvirate was becoming undone, and a new war was looming. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Over there, I'm now releasing a brand new series on the Japanese invasion of North China and Inner Mongolia. Also, please do check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/The Pacific War Channel, where for as little as $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive Patreon podcast, early access to all of my content, and voting rights for what subjects I will tackle next. Please check it out. While it seemed a decent compromise had been established with the triumvirate of Jang Suuchi, Duan Xile, and Fang Yuyuan, dark clouds were emerging across the horizon. The Guomingjun and the Kuomintang were both getting in bed with the Reds, and soon everyone would be mobilizing for another grand war.